Back in the summer of 2020, amidst all the news that was coming out about COVID, the lockdowns, the pockets of outbreaks, the BLM protests and riots across the country, the election, amidst all that, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a monumental ruling that went completely under the radar. People pretty much across the board missed it because of everything else that was happening at that particular time. But that ruling, it was really monumental because what it effectively did is that it took the authority that the Oklahoma state government had over the entirety of the landmass of Oklahoma, and it cut it in half. Overnight, the Oklahoma state government lost the authority in half of their state. You see, back in the year 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed a treaty which established an area that encompasses almost the entire eastern half of present-day Oklahoma as being a Native American reservation. However, as we all know, over the last 190 years, different laws have come out of Congress which have effectively chipped away at these lands, or rather, the claims that the Native Americans have to those lands. But that all changed in 2020, when the U.S. Supreme Court officially determined that the laws and treaties that have been passed in the last roughly 200 years have not disestablished these reservations, and that the Native Americans who live there still have the rights of a sovereign nation within the United States, not subject to the Oklahoma state government. Furthermore, the Supreme Court ruling, it also confirmed that the Native American citizens residing on this reservation no longer fall under the jurisdiction of either Oklahoma state or local police, but rather only to the local tribe police and the federal government. And the reason that this matters for people, not just the people living in Oklahoma, across the whole country rather, is that this ruling also sets a new precedent that other Native American tribes across the U.S. could use to try and claw back the land that was promised to them by treaties signed hundreds of years ago. And so let's go through the details of this case, as well as the implications that it has moving forward for other states throughout the nation. And I hope that if you appreciate content like this, you take a quick moment to smash those like and subscribe buttons so that it can reach ever more people via the YouTube algorithm. Now, to start with, in order to understand some of the legal aspects of this case, I want to provide a very, very brief overview of the 5 most important pieces of legislation that shaped the current situation of Native Americans. Again, this is a very brief overview. You could easily put together an entire college-level course on just this subject alone. I just want to present the legal framework that led up to the situation in Oklahoma as it was in, let's say, 1997. If I leave anything important out that you think should have been put in here, please leave it in the comment section below. Now, with that out of the way, let's rewind the clock back to the year 1830. That was when the U.S. Congress passed something known as the Indian Removal Act, and it was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. That piece of legislation, it led to what's known as the Trail of Tears. That's the moniker that was given to the forced migration of roughly 100,000 Native Americans from their ancestral homelands on the east side of the Mississippi River to reservations that were set up for them on the west side of the Mississippi River. And there's a reason that it's called the Trail of Tears. These people, they were not only getting ripped off of their actual homelands, but also the men, women, children, and especially the elderly had to walk on foot and horseback to make the nearly 1,000-mile journey. Many died of hunger, disease, and exposure. And if you look at it on the map, the tribes located in Appalachia, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, Florida, and several other states, they were forcibly marched over 1,000 miles to an area that pretty much nowadays would cover the entire eastern part of present-day Oklahoma. Once we're settled on these reservations, Native American tribes began the arduous task of reestablishing their own systems of governance, doing things like electing or choosing their own leaders, establishing courts of justice, starting up their own schools, and so on. However, throughout these subsequent years, you had dozens of additional treaties getting struck and new laws getting passed over in Congress that chipped away at the sovereignty of the Native Americans living on these reservations west of the Mississippi River. For example, when the system first began, if you had a Native American who killed another Native American on the reservation, the justice to be dealt would be decided by the Native American courts. In fact, there was a unanimous Supreme Court ruling that was made in the year 1883, which concluded that the federal courts have no jurisdiction over the murder of one Native American by another, because Congress did not give the courts that particular authority. But have no fear, because exactly 2 years later, after that Supreme Court ruling, they did. In 1885, Congress passed something known as the Major Crimes Act. This was a federal law that gave the U.S. federal government jurisdiction over certain types of crimes committed by Native Americans on tribal lands, regardless of whether or not the victim was a Native American him or herself. The crimes included things like murder, assault, kidnapping, arson, burglary, robbery, and so on. And this law began a process of slowly stripping away the autonomy that was enjoyed by the tribes on their designated land. And regarding that designated land, within the context of the Major Crimes Act of 1885, Indian country, as defined in the law, was defined as follows, quote, all land within the limits of any Indian reservation under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government, notwithstanding the issuance of any patent and including the right of way running through the reservation. Now, initially, when the system was set up, the Indian reservations were communal lands that were collectively owned by Native American tribes in perpetuity for future generations to be used however they wished. But this all started to change as more and more laws got passed. One such law was the General Allotment Act of 1887, also known as the Dawes Act. This one law single-handedly upended the native system of communal land ownership. The act, it ordered the division of the reservations into smaller parcels of land, as well as required all Native American citizens to also become official U.S. citizens. Now, while U.S. citizenship is often framed positively, by extending civil rights to minority populations, for natives, it basically abridged the rights that were traditionally afforded to them by their tribal nations, like, for instance, the right to vote. The idea was that by dividing these native lands into smaller parcels of private property, Native Americans would become more, quote-unquote, civilized and in tune with the American way of thinking in terms of private property ownership, which in the U.S. means commoditizing the land for maximum financial benefit. And so that is the ostensibly positive way of framing it. The unspoken aspect of this particular law was that land allotments were also designed to essentially dismantle tribal nations and to exterminate indigenous cultures by commodifying their lands and thrusting them into the commodity economy. Tribes essentially went, after the passage of this law, from grazing, hunting with a supportive communal living system, which sustained them for generations, to instead individual tribal families being thrust into an unfamiliar economic system that forced natives to establish their own successful smallhold farms or face removal if they just couldn't keep up with the economy. This change, it resulted in many Native Americans opting to sell their own land to the white settlers. Furthermore, after each Native American was allotted their plot of land based on the standing within their tribe, any remaining land was deemed excess and was ordered to be made available for purchase by non-natives, which obviously had the effect of slowly chipping away at the size of the actual reservations. All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment. Listen, it's obvious that the financial system is not looking too great. After being pumped up with trillions of virtually free government dollars for many, many years now, well, the stock bubble might actually burst in the near future. And in that process, unfortunately, it could take away the nest egg of anyone who happens to be exposed to it. And so consider taking this opportunity to diversify into something which is beyond the grasp of Washington, D.C. and Wall Street, physical gold and silver. And the best company to use, in my opinion, is the sponsor of today's episode, American Hartford Gold, who, I should mention, is also my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. And besides myself, they have thousands of 5-star reviews from other Americans, and they also have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. And working with them is rather simple. They have a huge selection of coins, bars, and rounds to choose from. They have super friendly staff who you can call, and they can set up either gold delivery directly to your doorstep, or they can even set you up in a gold IRA. And then lastly, best of all, if you tell them the Roman sent you, they will throw in a free gold coin with your first qualifying purchase. So give them a call. The number is 866-242-2352. That's 866-242-2352. Or you can simply text Roman to 65532. I'll also throw a link to their webpage. It'll be down there in the description box below. Now, interestingly, within the context of the General Allotment Act of 1887, 5 tribes were exempt. These were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, and the Seminole. Collectively, these 5 would later come to be known as the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes. However, that setup did not last long because within 10 years, Congress passed something known as the Curtis Act of 1898, which stripped away the protected status of these 5 exempted tribes, meaning that the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, as well as the Seminole tribes also had their land allotted into these private land holdings. This one change by itself, it had the effect of removing about 90 million acres of Native American land from the reservation. This law also had a pretty wild provision which states that tribal governments, courts, and land claims would all be abolished by the year 1906. In other words, it effectively ended government recognition of tribal governments, effectively revoking their autonomy. Then, in 1906, Congress passed the Five Civilized Tribes Act. This law, it aimed to essentially finalize the disposition of the affairs of the five civilized tribes in the Indian Territory and assimilate them into American society. Some key provisions in that particular law, it included things like closure of tribal rolls, effectively ending the enrollment of new members, sale of unallotted lands by the Secretary of the Interior with the proceeds going into the U.S. Treasury. Tribal government continuation was allowed until otherwise provided by law, which allowed some tribes to maintain a degree of autonomy. It authorized the sale of town sites within the tribe's territories. It transferred control of tribal schools to the U.S. government, and it clarified that mineral rights under tribal lands will be held in trust by the U.S. government. And so collectively, the Curtis Act and the Five Civilized Tribes Act dissolved Indian Territory, and it enabled Oklahoma to become a state, which it did the following year in 1907. And to give you a visual representation of how this all looked visually, let me show you a short video of the territories controlled by these five tribes over a period of time. And so, no matter how you slice it, that is a major loss of land over the course of just 70 odd years. Then you get to 1907, and that was when President Teddy Roosevelt, he signed Presidential Proclamation 780, officially declaring Oklahoma to be the 46th state in the Union. This proclamation, it was a symbol of the federal government's recognition of Oklahoma's sovereignty. And there's something very interesting worth mentioning about Oklahoma's admittance into the Union, about the ceremony they held when they did it. Part of the Statehood Day celebration was this unique ceremony, which symbolically showed the uniting of the Oklahoma Territory and the Indian Territory through a mock marriage. The idea of this symbolic marriage between the Oklahoma territories and the Indian territories was conceived to represent the union of two territories which had previously been seen as separate entities. The ceremony has actually been reenacted numerous times over the years, including in 1932 for the 25th anniversary of statehood, as well as in 2007 for the Oklahoma Centennial. And from 2007, we actually have a video of this wedding ceremony from the perspective of the Native Americans. Take a watch.
Do you, Miss Pioneer, spirit of the American lust for Indian land, take this Indian man to be your unlawfully taken husband, to rush him before he's had a chance to stand up, to ravage him when he is down, to forsaking all his history in favor of whitewashing your crimes and covering the injustice of land theft over his objection? I told you, you know you want it. That's after the ceremony.
Very cool. Then, about 27 years after Oklahoma became its own state, the U.S. federal Congress passed something known as the Indian Reorganization Act. It was signed into law by FDR on June 18, 1934, and it aimed to restore tribal sovereignty and self-governance to Native American tribes, essentially reversing previous policies that promoted things like assimilation and land allotment. It became the centerpiece of what became known as the Indian New Deal, and it allowed tribes to establish their own governments and manage their own lands, while also at the same time receiving federal support for things like education and general economic development. Also, the federal government provided funds that the Native Americans were able to use to purchase land and add millions of additional acres to their reservations. The Reorganization Act from FDR, it remains essentially the basis of federal legislation concerning Indian affairs in the modern context. And so that is all the legal backdrop for what took place in the year 1997. That was when a man named Jim C. McGirt, who was a tribal citizen of the Seminole Nation, molested his wife's 4-year-old granddaughter. For this crime, he was arrested indicted on 3 felony counts, tried in Oklahoma State Court, and he was ultimately sentenced to 1,000 years in prison plus an additional life sentence. However, like a dying man grasping for any straw he can grab, Mr. McGirt began to appeal his state-level decision to anyone who might listen. And eventually, after 20 years of appealing, Mr. McGirt was finally able to push his case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, where his lawyers were arguing that his state conviction was not valid because the crime in question took place on Muscogee Nation territory, and therefore, it actually fell under the jurisdiction of the federal government according to the Major Crimes Act of 1885. Their basic argument was that, essentially, the state government has no jurisdiction in this particular case because the alleged crime took place between 2 Native Americans on Native American soil. And indeed, after hearing oral arguments in the case, the U.S. Supreme Court shocked many people when the conservative majority on the court ruled in favor of Mr. McGirt. Specifically, in a 5-4 split decision, Justices Sonia Sotomayor, Alina Kagan, Neil Gorsuch, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Justice Breyer held that for the purposes of enforcing the Major Crimes Act, land reserved for the Muscogee Nation since the 19th century remains quote-unquote Indian country, and therefore, the state of Oklahoma has no jurisdiction to prosecute crimes committed there. Here is what the majority opinion of the court stated, and for your reference, it was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch. Quote, "On the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. Forced to leave their ancestral lands in Georgia and Alabama, the Creek Nation received assurances that their new lands in the West would be secure forever. In exchange for ceding all their land east of the Mississippi River, the U.S. government agreed by treaty that the Creek country west of the Mississippi shall be solemnly guaranteed to the Creek Indians. Today we are asked whether the lands these treaties promised remains an Indian reservation for purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word." Essentially, the ruling found that because of the treaty that was signed nearly 200 years ago, the Muscogee Nation, otherwise known as the Creek Nation as mentioned in the ruling, does have a reservation in the eastern part of Oklahoma. That reservation, it was never disestablished by Congress, and therefore, it still exists to this day as a separate entity from Oklahoma itself. And furthermore, if there's a need to prosecute a tribal member for committing a crime on that reservation, it's either going to be the federal government and or the Creek Nation itself that's responsible for doing so, not the state. And the implications of this are huge. For Mr. McGirt himself, the child abuser, his state-level conviction was thrown out and he was retried by the federal government. And instead of getting 1,000 years behind bars, he was only given 30 years. But a plea deal actually gave him credit for time served, and since he had already been incarcerated since the year 1997, he was released back into the public in May of this year. And so ultimately, his appeal was successful, and you had a convicted child predator led back out onto the streets. And so that is Mr. McGirt's story. But the ruling's implications, of course, don't end there. You see, even though the ruling was specifically addressing the Creek Nation, the precedent was set. And shortly after the Supreme Court ruling was issued, other cases quickly began to get brought forth in front of the state appeals court from both the other 4 quote-unquote civilized nations, along with a handful of cases from lesser-known nations, all looking to claw back their authority on their own reservations. And every single one of them has proven successful. All of them used the Supreme Court ruling that came out of McGirt as a precedent, and in every single case, the court ruled in favor of the tribal nation's rights to not be tried at the state level. As a result, what wound up happening is that since the year 2020, the Oklahoma state government effectively lost jurisdiction to prosecute crimes on about half of their land, about 19 million acres in total. Just for your reference, that's an area that's larger than 9 U.S. states. Now, once the dust settled, you had some media outlets, as well as some congressional leaders, frame this whole decision as a ruling that gave half of Oklahoma back to the Native Americans. However, that's not exactly true. The Supreme Court decision in McGirt did not discuss the issue of land ownership at all. It only touched on the subject of criminal jurisdiction. For instance, the Creek Nation's lands featured in the case, which, just for your reference, by the way, include the city of Tulsa, it remained owned almost entirely as private property by non-tribal members. And there's nothing in the McGirt decision that allows Native Americans to force non-natives to sell off their land as a historical reservation. But with that being said, The decision was a huge win for Native American rights because it returned to the Creek Nation, as well as to all the other nations, their inherent sovereign power to prosecute minor crimes involving Indians on their own reservations. Although it's a responsibility that many of them were not ready for. You see, after this decision was made, the number of criminal cases that tribal courts began having to deal with, it absolutely exploded in number. As just one example, instead of handling several dozen criminal cases a year, the Cherokee system is now responsible for several thousand cases every single year. That's a graph that looks pretty much like a hockey stick. And it's really hard for the judges, the lawyers, and the prosecutors in that system to be able to keep up. Furthermore, in an interview with New Yorker magazine, the head prosecutor of the Choctaw Nation, he said that the tribe's caseload increased by more than 2,000% since the McGirt ruling. It's an increase so large that cases are starting to fall through the cracks. And in order to address the influx of all these new cases, the tribal nations are actually looking to willingly work alongside the state government in some sort of a capacity. And to that end, the state of Oklahoma, alongside the tribal nations, they issued a joint statement following the McGirt decision. Here's what it said, quote, "The nations and the state are committed to implementing a framework of shared jurisdiction that will preserve sovereign interest and rights to self-government while affirming jurisdictional understandings, procedures, laws, and regulations that support public safety, our economy, and private property rights. We will continue our work, confident that we can accomplish more together than any of us could alone." However, even with this friendly statement, there are, right now, a lot of cases involving jurisdictional disputes that are making their way through the Oklahoma court system, especially because of the city of Tulsa. Tulsa, Oklahoma is a major city, but it's located right inside of several Indian reservations. And so as just one example of the many jurisdictional issues, here's one question. Who gets to keep the speeding ticket revenue? You have state troopers and local police enforcing the speed limit in order to keep the streets safe, but then the tribes claim that the revenue from those tickets should actually go to the tribal governments, especially when the person getting ticketed happens to be a tribal citizen. That's just one of several dozen types of cases that are now in the process of getting adjudicated at the state level. In fact, there's a really strange case right now in front of the state Supreme Court wherein you have the brother of the sitting Oklahoma governor, who himself is a tribal citizen, arguing that he should be immune from paying the city a speeding fine that was incurred on native land in the city of Tulsa. And the reason that this is such an ironic case is because his brother, who is, again, the governor of Oklahoma, and who, again, happens to be a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, the governor is a leading figure in the fight against advancing native rights. And the governor is not just fighting for a few dollars that'll come from speeding tickets. Instead, the governor's main concern is that the Supreme Court ruling in McGirt, it will open up the floodgates to further litigation that will take more and more power from state officials and return it to the native tribes, including massive amounts of resources as well as taxes. Here is a short video of the governor speaking right in front of the U.S. Supreme Court building over in Washington, D.C.
Some of the most violent crimes, they're just going unprosecuted in eastern Oklahoma. As the governor, my job is to protect law and order and enforce justice for native victims and all 4 million Oklahomans.
Do you see a connection between the McGirt decision and the functioning of oil and gas in Oklahoma?
If it's expanded to be a reservation for all purposes, and that's not the position of the state, that's not the position of the court behind us, it was just for the Major Crimes Act, but sure, this could erode oil and gas. And so those are things that it'll either be endless litigation or we'll get some clarity around this.
And at stake is a lot. You have billions of dollars in the rights to land titles, mineral rights, taxes. 40% of the oil and gas production in Oklahoma happens in the eastern part of the state on native lands. And so the governor's worried that if somehow the native tribes are able to reassert their authority even further, well, they could claw away some of the biggest industries and the biggest tax bases from the Oklahoma state government. And as such, Oklahoma is, you can say, on the legal offensive to undermine McGirt in any way possible. The state government, alongside big players from the oil industry, have already filed dozens of petitions to the U.S. Supreme Court looking to prevent natives from gaining full control of the land rights and the natural resources on their own reservations. Now, only time will tell how those cases will ultimately play themselves out, but just for your reference, the McGirt decision was one of the final decisions made while Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still a Supreme Court justice. And ever since she got replaced by Amy Coney Barrett, the court's makeup seems to have changed in regard to native rights, with a few recent cases giving us a bit of an indication that the new conservative majority on the court wants to narrow the influence of McGirt as much as possible. Although, frankly, you never know. Sometimes the U.S. Supreme Court really does surprise you. Regardless, though, in regards to you, the person watching this video, this all matters even if you happen to not live in Oklahoma. That's because the Oklahoma state government is not the only one that's pushing this particular issue. In the weeks following the Supreme Court ruling in McGirt, several other Native American tribes across the country began citing the precedent to reassert their own treaty rights in other parts of the U.S. For instance, over in Wisconsin, an appeals court ruled in favor of the Oneida Nation, saying that they don't need permits from a local village if what they're doing takes place on their reservation, because that reservation was never disestablished by Congress, which is the exact same language from the Oklahoma case. And so there you have it. The Native American tribes in this country right now have a new legal precedent that they can use, and that they are using, to claw back some of the autonomy that they lost over the past 200 years. However, frankly, their success is likely going to be limited. That's because the situation in Oklahoma was very specific to that particular region. And so even if other tribes in other parts of the country can use the precedent set in McGirt to claw back some rights, it's likely never going to be expanded to giving back something like New York, Chicago, or Ohio, or anything like that. Oklahoma's Native Americans, they're currently in the spotlight over this issue because it really is a unique case, given just how much specific promises the U.S. government made during that Trail of Tears period, but then just never delivered on. They made promises, but very specifically never kept them. It seems like now they're being forced to deliver, at least partially. But hey, I'd love to know your thoughts on this issue. Do you think that the U.S. government, besides just criminal rights, should return the land rights in the eastern part of Oklahoma as well back to the Native Americans? That would essentially make good on the promise that President Johnson made to the Native Americans all the way back in the year 1830. Or are you of the opinion that the U.S. government had every right to colonize the U.S. in its best interest, which often meant claiming the valuable property from the native tribes, regardless of past promises and past treaties? I'd love to know your thoughts. Please leave them in the comments section below. I'll be reading through them later tonight as well as into the week. Also, if you'd like to go through any of the documents that we went through in today's episode, I'll throw the links to them. You can find them down in the description box below. And also, if you think I missed something important, I only went through the sort of 5 major pieces of legislation throughout the last 170 years that were relevant to this case. But this is, again, a very large topic. So if you think there was some key point that I missed in this case that really maybe changes the frame of reference that we should be viewing this case from, I'd love to know it. Please leave it in the comment section below. I'm sure both myself and everybody watching this episode will appreciate it. So if you have some deep knowledge on this issue, leave it in the comment section below. Again, myself and everybody would appreciate it. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.